Thank you, Dave and Susan. And good evening, all. Good to see you. Glad to have you with us this evening. If you would, let's take our Bibles and let's turn to Joshua. We're going to be in chapters 16 through 18. So we're going to try to cover 3 chapters this evening, but we'll do it by a lot of sections. We're just going to sort of give headings, general ideas of what's going on, simply because there's just a lot of territories and measurements and laying out the boundaries of the land. So we're not going to go through all of that, but we're going to highlight a few things as we make our way through. Getting close to the end of the book of Joshua, and I was thinking the other day, trying to decide upon what direction to go when we finish. So I think when we finish with this, we're just going to go right on into the book of Judges. Makes sense because I've mentioned several times that there are things that are being pointed out, and we'll do some of that tonight in the book of Joshua, that certainly lays the groundwork for what we deal with when we get to the book of Judges as well. So we're just going to plan on moving right on through and staying in some historical books for a little bit. So in Joshua chapter 16 through 18, I've kind of got this broken up, like I said, in some real simple summary statements to help us just have the general idea of what's going on in certain sections of Scripture, so that we don't have to read through all of the borders and that sort of thing. We'll actually use the map to point some of those things out as we make our way through. So in chapter 16, here's what we have. To begin with, in verses 1 through 4, we have a general description of the allotment that's given to Ephraim and West Manasseh, and that's given together in verses 1 through 4. And basically, what that covers, really, what's being referred to in those verses of Scripture, is all this territory right here. So this yellowish green color, all the way down to this lavender, all of that right there is what's basically being described in verses 1 through 4. And we're being told what the overall piece of land, the territory that's going to be given to Ephraim and the tribe of West Manasseh. Because obviously, remember, East Manasseh is on the other side of the Jordan as well, okay? And then, of course, we have the borders of Ephraim's allotment in particular. And so it gets into more detail when we get into verses 5 through 10, dealing with Ephraim at this point, which is that lavender purplish color that I pointed out just a moment ago, just below East Manasseh. But the one thing what I did want to point out to you in this particular section, which I made reference a minute ago, about that there are some key statements along the way that's being pointed out to us, that is laying the groundwork for what we see in the book of Judges. And we see another one of those in verse 10 of chapter 16, where it says, "And they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites to this day and have become forced laborers." So there's another one of those statements, because remember what God has said? You're to drive the inhabitants of the land out of the territory. And while they were going through the 7 years of conquest, more times than not, that resulted in those inhabitants basically all being killed by the edge of the sword. And so while the army was going through during the 7 years of the conquest initially, which we've covered in the early part of Joshua, they were going through and they were conquering the strongholds, the stronger cities, the stronger kings, and so forth. And so they made that conquest. And now what is to happen is the remainder of the conquest of the land is to be done by the individual tribes. So when the tribe of Ephraim was given their territory, as we pointed out there a moment ago, it was their responsibility to go in and finish the job of purging the land of the pagans that were there, okay? Every tribe was now to take their territory, and it's left to them to go in and finish cleaning up the territory, all right? But what we're finding is that's not happening. as we make our way through. So then we come to chapter 17. And you notice, obviously we're going to jump through large or past some large sections of Scripture because there's large portions here that just deal with the borders and the boundaries that are laid out. So it's easier for me to point that out on a map than for us just to go through and read all of that, okay? Chapter 17, what we have are the borders of West Manasseh and their allotment, okay? So we were given a few moments ago the general territory where they would be. Now it's being laid out in more specific manner. And you find that in verses 1 through 13. And so if you look at the map, you go back to what I pointed out just a moment ago. For West Manasseh, their borders are all mentioned in verses 1 through 13. There are some other particulars in there about land that is allotted to certain people within Manasseh. But overall, it's just laying out for us what their boundaries are. But I want you to notice, if you would, verses 12 through 13 of chapter 17. Notice what we read here. And it says, "Yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities." So there are some cities that are mentioned in those earlier verses in chapter 17. "But the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it happened that when the children of Israel grew strong, that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out." We've seen the same thing now within 2 chapters. Ephraim could not drive the Canaanites out, so what did they do? They made them indentured servants, basically. Forced labor. Where you say, well, they were at least subservient to the tribe of Ephraim. Or in this instance, they were at least subservient to the people of West Manasseh in that tribe. Yes, but the problem is this. They're still in the land. And they're still pagans. And they're still worshiping their pagan gods. And they're still doing their pagan things. Maybe it has been limited to some degree, okay? But the point is, it's still going on. They're still in the land. And all they're doing is setting themselves up. Israel is setting themselves up for failure in the future. Because you get to the book of Judges, guess what happens? You find Israel starts backsliding over and over and over and again. Well, why the backsliding? Because of this influence that is still in the land. Okay? So listen, that's a really good example for us as believers. You know, in our life, if we're going to be faithful and walk with the Lord and honor Him and avoid as many stumbling blocks as we possibly can, one of the things that we have to be willing to do is we have to be willing to be totally, ruthlessly honest with ourselves about the things that are in our life that need to go. Because if we leave some of these things, though it might be on a little limited basis and so forth, you know, before too long, that molehill turns into a mountain. And it becomes a stumbling block. Same principle applies to us. We have to be willing to do the hard work of ridding our life of things that do not honor the Lord and that are not needful in our life and that do not produce spiritual maturity, spiritual passion, things that drain away our spiritual energies and focus and so forth. I remember when I first started preaching, there was a man that was coming to our church. I used to know his name. I can't remember his first name right now. He had lived a worldly life and alcohol and all kinds of stuff in his life. And I remember my pastor at the time led him to the Lord. And one of the first things my pastor told him was, now you need to go home, and anything in your home that reminds you of your past sinful lifestyle, you need to get it out of your house. You want to know something? He did. I mean, he went home and he just chunked a whole bunch of stuff. Because he took seriously what he was told, that if you want to remain faithful on this path and not have stumbling blocks along the way that are going to hurt you, then you need to take the action now. And that's basically what Israel was saying, or what God was saying to Israel. So a couple of things I want to talk about here. So what we're dealing with now is this. Because last week we saw Judah's inheritance. Remember that dark green section in the southern part of the map? Judah's inheritance. So here we're dealing with Ephraim and Manasseh, or West Manasseh, the half tribe on the west side over here, okay? And in reality, even the east side is included in this to a degree. So here's one of the things to kind of think about. Next to Judah, Judah was the largest tribe, or equally as large as Manasseh was. Manasseh was a large tribe. So you might ask the question, well, why did Judah need so much territory? It was a large tribe. Why does Manasseh need so much territory? One on the east, one on the west. Large tribe, okay, a lot of people there. Larger than the other, much larger than the other tribes. And so therefore, they were given the largest portions of land. Now, the size of their tribe has a whole lot to do with that. But there was something even greater than that resulted in them receiving. And here's another thing to kind of think about is this. In some sense, Judah and Manasseh are given the choicest portions of the land. Okay? So you ask why? Well, it all has to do with because of the blessing of God upon them through Jacob. Remember, Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes. Now, if you go to Genesis chapter 48, you know what you'll read in Genesis chapter 48? Towards the end of Jacob's life, he pronounced his blessing upon his sons. Judah, which is the largest tribe, received a significantly greater blessing from Jacob than did his other 10 brothers from the mother Leah, okay? Because remember, Jacob had 2 wives. There was Leah and there was Rachel. Rachel was the wife that he most loved. He's the one that he originally worked all those years for Laban, so that at the end of that, she would be his wife, but Laban did a switcheroo on the honeymoon night, you know, Jacob, he was blinded by passion and didn't realize he had the wrong woman in there at that time, And so he had a switcheroo. And then he worked for another X number of years so that he could have. But Rachel was the wife that he loved. Leah was the one that bore him the most children, 10. Judah was born of Leah. But of those 10 brothers, Judah was the one who received the greatest blessing from his father, and therefore the blessing of God was upon him. Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's sons, right? Joseph was the son born to Jacob by whom? Rachel. Not only that, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Now, you start running into problems when you start doing that, don't you? Why do you think the other 10 brothers of Joseph, the sons of Leah, why do you think they threw him in a hole and sold him into slavery? Jacob was a lot to blame for that because of the favoritism that he had shown to Joseph, and Joseph had an attitude because of it. And remember, Joseph was the one that Jacob gave him the coat of many colors. He had never done that for any of his other sons, okay? And so, at the end of Jacob's life, when they're still in Egypt, in Genesis chapter 48, he bestows a greater blessing also on Joseph, but that blessing is then also passed on to Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, okay? So all that factors into the reason why the territory that they received, not only the size of the tribes, but the blessing that had been bestowed upon them, okay? And so you notice as you look there, you can see on the map, you see the size of the territory of Judah. You see the territory that Manasseh has partly on the east side, partly on the west, all right? But I want you to notice, but now remember, Ephraim is also a son of Joseph. He doesn't have a huge amount of territory, right? He's got this purple area right here. But look at that picture and ask yourself this question. Where is Ephraim located in light of the whole context of the promised land? Where's he at? He's at the heart. He's at the heart. Because remember, when Jacob blessed Manasseh and Ephraim, Manasseh was the oldest, but Jacob, and so his right hand should have gone on Manasseh and his left hand on Ephraim, but Jacob changed his hands, and it bothered Joseph. He objected to it, and he told him, said, no, I know what I'm doing. And so as a result of that, that's why Ephraim is at the very heart of the promised land and the tribal allotments. And so then we move on from verses 1 through 13, and we come down to chapter 17 and verses 14 through 18. And so after Ephraim and Manasseh, West Manasseh, have this tribal allotment, they come to Joshua with a request. I want you to listen to this. So they said, "Then the children of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, 'Why have you given us only one lot and one share to inherit, since we are a great people, inasmuch as the Lord has blessed us until now?'" Now, in reality, let me tell you who's bringing this question up. Ephraim comes with Manasseh, but Manasseh is the one that's really asking for this request. What he's asking for is more land. He's already been given a pretty good sized piece of land. He wants more. Okay? Verse 15. So Joshua answered them, "If you are a great people, then go up to the forest country and clear a place for yourself there in the land of the Perizzites and the giants, since the mountains of Ephraim are too confined for you." But the children of Joseph said, "The mountain country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites who dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both those who are of Beth-shean and its towns, and those who are of the valley of Jezreel." So here's apparently what had happened, okay? So remember, here's Ephraim, you've got Manasseh, all this territory, but apparently what had happened was that when they go in to begin settling in the land, they come to realize that their opponents have got chariots of iron, okay? They don't have anything like that. So fear sets in. We can't beat these people. That sounds kind of like what the original spies did at Kadesh Barnea, right? We can't beat these people. They've got chariots of iron. So there's fear, there's lack of faith. So here's what they do. Rather than spreading out in the territory, taking advantage of all the land, go out and conquer it, they all kind of crowd in on Ephraim. And so now what you've got is this. You've got two tribes, one that is a very sizable tribe, and they're all trying to squeeze in on a small parcel of ground. So they come back to Joshua and they say, "Hey, we need more land." Well, look at Joshua's response. Here's what he says. "And Joshua spoke to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, saying, 'You are a great people and have great power.'" You kind of get this idea. Here's the way I read what Joshua's doing. They're afraid. He's trying to be positive and suggest to them, because remember at the front, if you are a great people. Here he says to them, you are a great people. It's kind of like he's having to try to tell them, remember who is on your side? Who's fighting for you? He says, you are a great people and you have great power. You shall not have one lot, but the mountain country shall be yours. Although it is wooded, you shall cut it down, and its farthest extent shall be yours. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have iron chariots and are strong. So here's what Joshua was saying. Okay, boys, you want more land? I'll give you more land. Here's how you get it. Go out and do the hard work and clear the land I gave you. That's the answer. There's plenty of room out there for you. You've just got to be willing to go out and do the hard work and claim what has already been given to you. Now, you know, there's an important lesson for us to learn. So often, we sometimes think that we need, if only I had this, or if only I had that. You know, I could do more for the Lord, or I could be a more effective person, or whatever the case may be. The reality is we just have to learn to use what God has given us. And sometimes the difference maker between those who are successful at something and those that are not successful is not that one has more resources than the other, but what they have is the willingness to work hard. That's oftentimes the difference maker. They didn't want to go out there and have to do that. And so he says, okay, boys, I'm going to give you more land. And here it is, out there. Go clear the woods. One of the reasons why Joshua was saying is one of the reasons why he gave Manasseh the territory he did that had forest and trees is because they were so numerous. There was plenty of them to do it. They just had to be willing to go out and get it done. Okay? F.B. Meyer. Any of y'all ever heard of F.B. Meyer? Are you familiar with him? He's an English preacher. He was a contemporary of D.L. Moody. A great preacher, prolific author. I mean, he wrote like 75 books. I love reading his material. Here's what he had to say about this. He said, the greatness of the children of Joseph did not arise from their numbers. In other words, he's saying what was really going to make them great was not that there was a lot of them. Okay? But he goes on and he says this, very rightly Joshua bade them prove their greatness by their deeds. It is a vast misfortune when children live in the achievements of their parents instead of standing on their own feet. Besides, they had land enough if only they would drive out the Canaanites and would cut down the shaggy forest that encumbered the soil. And then he says this, all around us are uncleared forest. What a precious promise it is in Joshua 17:18 that we will conquer and succeed. And then he concludes and he says, now let's go cut down the wood. That's a very relevant application for all of us in our life, whether it be our home life, work life, church life, whatever the case may be. There's an important lesson there. And then we come to chapter 18. Now, before we go any further, any questions? Anybody? Thoughts? Okay. Chapter 18. So here in chapter number 18, here's what we see several things. In verses 1 through 7, we see the tabernacle in Shiloh. Okay? Verse 1 of chapter 18 says this. Now the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of meeting there. Now as I was reading over this today, something dawned on me. And I have to say, I've read through Joshua a number of times. I've preached through sections of Joshua over the years. Here's something I never realized until today. When you go back and you start reading the book of Joshua, we haven't heard anything about the tabernacle until now. I thought, well, that's interesting. We've heard about the Ark of the Covenant. We heard about the stones that were taken out of the Jordan River and set up on the bank on the west side of the Jordan, and the 12 stones that were set up in the middle of the Jordan. You don't hear anything about the tabernacle. And so then the question has to become, okay, so where has the tabernacle been? Apparently, it has actually been in Gilgal all this time. It just hasn't been mentioned. Now, there's not anything that directly says that. But here's what I can't imagine, because remember this, when Israel was making their way through the wilderness, whenever they would set up camp at a certain place, the tabernacle would always be erected, and the different tribes were stationed at different points all around the tabernacle. The tabernacle was always right there in the middle of the people of Israel. So apparently, the assumption must be that the tabernacle was set up in Gilgal. Now, so remember, how was it that they were determining who got what piece of property? We talked about this a couple of times, remember? They were casting lots, remember? They were casting lots. Joshua, the heads of the tribes, Eleazar the priest, and remember, and in whatever form the lots were taking place, we don't really know. Here's what Joshua, Eleazar, and the heads of the tribes were doing. They were there simply witnessing the lots and reading the lots together to affirm this is what the Lord has communicated to us through the lots, okay? So remember, they were casting lots in Gilgal. So apparently what they must have been doing is they must have been doing that at the door of the tabernacle, which is what we actually read later on in Joshua in chapter 19 and think chapter 21, okay? So apparently the tabernacle has been set up in Gilgal. It just hasn't said anything about it. But now notice where they moved it to. What does verse 1, where does it say they moved it to? Shiloh. Interesting thing, Shiloh means peace or confidence. And guess where Shiloh is located? It's located right here in Ephraim. So now we said Ephraim is located, what, at the heart, in the center of the nation? Remember when Israel was encamped and the tabernacle was set up, the tabernacle was always in the center of the people? God has put the tabernacle, again, right in the center of his people at Shiloh. And it would be from there that the tabernacle services and so forth would take place for quite some time, up until the time of David. So then, beginning in verse number 3, we see there's a challenge that is given to the 7 remaining tribes to claim their inheritance. Because, all right, so 5 tribes, by this time, 5 tribes already have their inheritance. We had Reuben and Gad and East Manasseh on the other side of the Jordan. We have Judah, we have Ephraim and West Manasseh on the west side. Okay, so that's 5 tribes that have their allotment. There are 7 tribes that have not yet claimed their allotment. Okay, so look at verse number 3. It says, then Joshua said to the children of Israel, how long will you neglect to go and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers has given you? So in other words, here's what they've not been coming to them eagerly saying, we want our allotment. Judah did, Manasseh did, Reuben did, Gad did, Ephraim did. These other 7 tribes are kind of like sitting back and saying, it's kind of like this. I think they're like, this is not going to be easy. I think there was hesitancy about actually engaging in this thing. That's why Joshua comes and he challenges them and he says, why have you not gone and asked for your possession to go on and finish conquering and settling in the land? So look at verse 4. He says, I want you to pick out from among you 3 men from each tribe, and I will send them, and they shall rise and go through the land, survey it according to their inheritance, and come back to me, and they shall divide it into 7 parts. Judah shall remain in their territory on the south, the house of Joseph shall remain in their territory on the north. You shall therefore survey the land in 7 parts, and bring the survey here to me, that I may cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. But the Levites have no part among you, for the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. And Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have received their inheritance beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. Then the men arose to go away, and Joshua charged those who went to survey the land, saying, Go, walk through the land, survey it, and come back to me, that I may cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh. So the men went and passed through the land and wrote the survey in a book in 7 parts by cities, and they came to Joshua at the camp in Shiloh, and then Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord, and there Joshua divided the land to the children of Israel according to their divisions. So these men go out, they make this survey, they put it in a book. Basically what they do is they come back as the different tribes, these 7 tribes come to the temple, to the tabernacle I should say. They cast lots based upon that survey, and God gave guidance through the lots as to what parts of that survey would be assigned to different tribes. Okay? And so by that time, when that process is finished, every tribe has now had their allotment given to them in the promised land. It's their job to go and settle it, and as I said before, deal with the Canaanite inhabitants that are still there and finish in the conquering and the conquest of the land. Okay? And so beginning in verses 11 through 28, you start with the tribe of Benjamin. It is determined, and that brings us to the end of chapter number 18. And then what we'll do when we get into the following chapters, we'll just kind of hit some highlights regarding the allotment of the other tribes, and then we'll be making our way on towards the finish of the book of Joshua. All right, any questions? Now, I know that's a lot. That's like geography class, all right? But I think it's important to understand, because a lot of folks just really don't have a clue how all that stuff worked and came together, and how it was decided about who occupied what piece of territory, okay? All right, any thoughts, any questions, anybody? Daryl?
I'm just curious, I guess you're going to talk about this next week. Simeon?
Yes. Yeah, we'll get into that next week. Yeah. All right, anybody else? All right, we're going to sign off. Thank you for joining us online tonight. Have a blessed evening. Okay. All right, let's take a few moments and share some prayer requests.